My name's Alex, I'm 33, and I live in Seattle. I work as a software developer, the kind of job that's stable, keeps me busy, but also gives me time to enjoy life. Or at least, it did until recently that I met my wife, Jessica, about 9 years ago when we were both in our early 20s. I was at a friend's housewarming party, awkwardly nursing a drink in the corner, when she walked in. She had this energy, confident, sharp, and a little intimidating, if I'm being honest. We hit it off almost immediately. She was finishing up her degree in English literature at the time, and I was just starting to find my footing in my career. That we dated for about 3 years before getting married. It felt right. She was my best friend, my partner in crime, and for a while, my world. We traveled, bought a condo together, and even talked about starting a family. Things were good, until they weren't. Over the past year, something started to shift. Jessica became distant, more preoccupied with work, or so she said. She'd started a new job at a publishing company, and I figured the long hours and stress were just part of the adjustment. But it wasn't just the work. She was always on her phone, texting, laughing at messages she never shared with me. The warmth between us started to fade. Our conversations felt forced, like we were roommates instead of a married couple. At first, I tried to brush it off. Relationships go through rough patches, right? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know how bad it really was. The turning point came one night when Jessica said she had a work dinner. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. Her job often required networking events and late meetings. But something about the way she mentioned it felt off. Her eyes didn't meet mine, and her voice had this rehearsed, overly casual tone. After she left, I tried to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed to trust her. But as the hours ticked by and her work dinner stretched later and later, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Around 11 p.m., I noticed she left her iPad on the kitchen counter. Jessica was always meticulous about her devices, her phone, laptop, tablet. They were like extensions of herself. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the iPad, fully intending to prove myself wrong, to find nothing and feel stupid for even doubting her, but that's not what happened. She was still logged into her email. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't me. I wasn't the snooping husband. But the distance between us had been gnawing at me for months, and I needed answers. I opened her inbox, expecting to see boring work emails or event invites. Instead, I found a thread of messages labeled J. Anderson. At first, I thought it was just a colleague, until I opened the first email. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. You still have that effect on me, even after all these years. My stomach dropped. I scrolled further, each message worse than the last. I missed seeing you in class today. Let's make up for it tonight. I love how you're still as passionate about literature as you were back then. And other things too. That's when it hit me. J. Anderson wasn't just a colleague. He was her former professor, the one she'd always spoken about with this weird mix of admiration and nostalgia. I remembered her mentioning him years ago, how he'd inspired her love for literature. I never thought it was more than that, but here it was, in black and white. She wasn't just having an affair. She was having an affair with the man who had been her professor when she was a student. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My hands were shaking as I read through the emails, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? Was it just recently, or had it started back when she was still in school? I closed the iPad and sat there in silence, staring at the door, waiting for her to come home. My mind was a whirlwind of betrayal, confusion, and anger. The woman I loved, the life we built together, it all felt like a lie. When Jessica finally walked through the door around midnight, smiling like everything was fine, I knew things were about to explode. When Jessica finally walked through the door around midnight, she looked like she didn't have a care in the world. She tossed her purse on the counter, kicked off her heels, and shot me a casual smile like everything was normal. Hey, babe. Dinner ran late. You wouldn't believe how much these authors can talk. I sat there on the couch, gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles were white. The image of those emails burned into my brain. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. I could hear those words echoing in my head, louder than anything she was saying, but I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wanted to see how far she'd go with her lies. Oh yeah? I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. How was the dinner? She blinked, clearly not expecting me to take an interest. You know, the usual, she said, waving her hand dismissively as she walked toward the kitchen. Boring speeches, lots of small talk. I'm exhausted. I followed her with my eyes, feeling the anger bubble under the surface. I wanted to explode right there, but I needed to hear it from her first. I needed her to lie to my face. How come you didn't tell me Jay Anderson was at the dinner? I asked, my voice steady but cold. She froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Slowly, she turned to face me, her smile fading. What? Why would he be there? I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Don't play dumb, Jessica. I saw the emails. Her eyes darted to the iPad on the counter, and for a split second, I saw the panic flash across her face. But just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced with this cold, defiant look that made my stomach turn. I can't believe you went through my stuff, she snapped, crossing her arms. That's a violation of my privacy, Alex. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course. That was her angle. Not the cheating, not the betrayal, but the fact that I found out. Are you serious right now? I shot back. I violated your privacy? You've been sneaking around with your old professor, and you're mad that I figured it out? Her expression didn't change. She just shrugged, like it was no big deal. It's not like that. Oh, really? I said, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell is like that. You're telling me those emails were just friendly? Last night was amazing? That's just normal coworker talk. She rolled her eyes, like I was being unreasonable. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't even trying to deny it anymore. But the way she brushed it off, like I was the problem, it made my blood boil. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice low and sharp. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. A while, she finally admitted, her tone flat, like she was talking about the weather. It just happened. It just happened. I repeated, my voice cracking from the sheer absurdity of it. You don't accidentally fall into bed with someone, Jessica. Especially not someone who was your professor. Her face twisted into something almost smug. Well, maybe if you hadn't been so boring, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere. That was it. That was the moment I realized I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me. The person I married wouldn't have stabbed me in the back and then twisted the knife with a smile on her face. Get out, I said, my voice calm but firm. Pack your things and get out. She stared at me for a moment, like she was waiting for me to take it back, to beg her to stay. But when I didn't, she just scoffed and grabbed her purse. Fine, she spat, heading toward the bedroom. But don't think this is all on me, Alex. You weren't exactly husband of the year. I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching as she packed up her things and walked out the door without a second glance. As the door slammed shut behind her, I felt this strange mix of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, but also relief. The lies were over. The facade was gone. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. Now, it was just me and the truth. After the door slammed shut, the silence in the apartment felt deafening. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. I stood there for a minute, staring at the door like I expected her to walk back in and say it was all some kind of twisted joke. But she didn't. She was gone. And the weight of that reality hit me like a freight train that I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. We were supposed to grow old together, build a family, share inside jokes that no one else understood. But now? Now I was just some guy sitting alone in an apartment that suddenly felt too big. The anger came in waves. One minute, I was furious. How could she do this to me? How could she throw away everything we had? And the next, I was staring blankly at the wall, feeling nothing but numbness. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, every word she said, every lie she told. The way she shrugged it off, like I was just some obstacle in the way of her new life with him, and then there was that smug look on her face when she said I was boring. That one dug deeper than I expected. I'd worked so hard to be a good husband, to build a life with her. Was I really that oblivious? Did I miss all the signs because I was too focused on everything else? I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the ticking of the clock like it was counting down to some invisible deadline. At some point, I realized I couldn't stay in that apartment. Every corner of it screamed Jessica. Her perfume still lingered in the bedroom, her favorite mug sat in the kitchen sink, and the stupid throw blanket she insisted we buy was draped over the back of the couch. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I spent the entire day tearing through the apartment like a man possessed. I grabbed every trace of her clothes, her books, the photos of us smiling like idiots on vacations, and shoved them into trash bags. I didn't care where they went. I just needed them gone. The wedding album? Tossed it into a box without even looking at it. The anniversary cards we'd exchanged over the years? Shredded. It wasn't just about getting rid of her stuff. It was about reclaiming my space, my life. But even as I cleared the apartment, the memories clung to me like shadows. I found myself thinking about all the little moments, the way she used to curl up next to me on the couch, the inside jokes we shared, the way her laugh used to light up the room. It was like my brain couldn't decide whether to hate her or miss her, and then, just when I thought I'd hit rock bottom, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hey, Alex. I think we need to talk." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It was her. Jessica. The nerve she had to reach out after everything she'd done, it was unbelievable. But curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what she wanted. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was another round of her blaming me for her mistakes that I didn't respond right away. I sat there, debating whether to ignore her or give her a piece of my mind. But eventually, I typed out a reply. "Talk about what? You made yourself pretty clear last night." Her response came almost immediately. I think we left things unfinished. I owe you an explanation." An explanation? What more was there to explain? She cheated. She lied. She walked out like I was nothing. But still, a part of me needed to hear what she had to say. Not because I wanted her back, but because I wanted to understand how the person I loved turned into a stranger. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to meet. We decided on a neutral place, a coffee shop downtown. Somewhere public, where I wouldn't be tempted to yell or throw something. As I sat there waiting for her to show up, I felt this weird mix of anxiety and anticipation. What could she possibly say that would make any of this make sense? And then, I saw her. She walked in like nothing had happened, her hair perfectly styled, her face calm and composed. It was like she wasn't the woman who'd torn my heart out just days before. She spotted me, gave me a small, almost apologetic smile, and walked over to the table. "Hey," she said softly, sitting down across from me. I didn't say anything. I just stared at her, waiting. She took a deep breath, like she was preparing herself for some grand confession. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice gentle. "And I'm sorry. But you have to understand, it wasn't just about him. It was about us. Things haven't been right between us for a long time. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. There it was again, the blame. The excuses. So, sleeping with your professor was your solution? I shot back. That's how you fix a marriage? She flinched at my words but didn't back down. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. And I'm not proud of it. But I can't pretend like everything was perfect between us. I wanted to scream. She was twisting everything, making it sound like I was the reason she cheated. You could have talked to me, I said, my voice low but firm. You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, you lied. You betrayed me. She looked down at her coffee, silent for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't want to hurt you. Too late for that. I stood up, grabbing my jacket. You don't get to rewrite the story, Jessica. You made your choices. And now, I'm making mine. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, like she finally realized this was it. There was no going back. No fixing what she broke. Without another word, I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her behind, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Walking out of that coffee shop felt like stepping into a new reality. The weight of her excuses, her lies, all of it stayed behind in that booth, right where she belonged. But as much as I wanted to believe that conversation was the end of it, I knew it wasn't. You don't spend years building a life with someone, only to flip a switch and move on like they were never there. The weird thing was, after that meeting, I didn't feel as angry as I thought I would. I felt hollow. Like I'd been running on adrenaline for so long that when it finally drained out, there was nothing left but this aching emptiness. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, trying to find some hidden meaning, some clue that would explain everything. But all I saw was the same cold truth: the woman I loved was gone. The next few days were a blur. I went to work, went through the motions, but everything felt off. The apartment felt too quiet, the bed felt too big, and every little thing reminded me of her. The coffee mug she always used. The playlist we made for road trips. Even the stupid dent in the wall from that time we tried to hang a shelf and failed miserably. It was like our whole life was etched into the walls, and I couldn't escape it. I knew I needed to get out, to clear my head, so I called up my best friend, Mark. He'd been checking in on me since everything went down, but I hadn't really opened up to him about the details. It's not easy admitting your wife cheated on you, especially when you're the guy who always had it together. Dude, we're hitting the bar tonight, Mark said the second he picked up. No excuses. I didn't argue. I needed a distraction, and a night out sounded better than staring at my ceiling. We went to this dive bar we used to haunt in our college days, the kind of place with sticky floors, neon lights, and a jukebox that played the same 5 songs on repeat. It was loud, messy, and exactly what I needed. We grabbed beers, found a spot at the bar, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of normalcy. But of course, normal didn't last. About an hour in, after a few drinks had loosened me up, Mark leaned in. So, you gonna tell me what really happened with Jessica? I stared at my drink, debating whether to spill it all or just brush it off. But the truth was burning a hole in my chest, and I couldn't keep it in any longer. She cheated on me, I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the noise of the bar. With her old professor. Mark's eyes widened. You're kidding. I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. Wish I was. He sat back, processing that for a moment. Then he shook his head. What a piece of work. You're better off without her, man. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. I knew he was right, but it didn't make the sting any less painful. As the night wore on, the buzz from the beers dulled the sharp edges of my thoughts. We laughed, shot pool, and for a few hours, I almost felt like myself again. But just when I thought I'd escaped the shadow of Jessica, the universe decided to throw me a curveball. I was on my way back from the restroom when I saw her, Jessica, but she wasn't alone. She was standing near the back of the bar, her hand resting casually on the arm of a man I instantly recognized, J. Anderson. Her professor. The guy she threw our marriage away for. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They hadn't seen me yet, and for a split second, I considered turning around and pretending I hadn't seen them. But then Jessica leaned in, laughing at something he said, and that was it. I marched over before I could stop myself. "Wow," I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Didn't take you long, did it?" Jessica's smile froze on her face. She turned, her eyes widening when she saw me. J. Anderson James, I guess, just looked confused, like he had no idea who I was. "Alex," Jessica said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back, my eyes flicking to James. "But I guess I already know the answer." James finally seemed to piece it together. "Oh," he said, his face flushing. "You must be the husband," I snapped. "Or, I guess, the ex-husband." Jessica rolled her eyes, like I was being dramatic. "We're not doing this here, Alex." "Oh, I think we are," I said, feeling the anger boil over. I'd spent weeks drowning in her betrayal, and now here she was, flaunting it in front of me like it was no big deal. "You couldn't even wait a month before parading him around?" "Guess it really wasn't about us, huh?" People were starting to notice the scene, heads turning in our direction, but I didn't care. For once, I wanted her to feel just as exposed and humiliated as I did. Jessica's face hardened. "Grow up, Alex. This isn't about you." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Right. Because nothing was ever about me, was it?" I didn't wait for her response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bar, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I felt better or worse, but at least now, there was no doubt. She wasn't the person I fell in love with. She never was, and as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something else: that I was done. The walk home from the bar felt like I was moving through molasses. Every step felt heavy, like I was dragging the weight of the last few months behind me. Seeing Jessica with him, seeing them together in the flesh, was like pouring salt into a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. But oddly enough, there was a strange kind of finality to it, too. Like watching a door slam shut and knowing you'd never open it again. When I got back to the apartment, it felt even emptier than before. But this time, the emptiness didn't suffocate me. It felt like the first breath after holding it for too long. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the blank walls where our photos used to hang, and realized that I was finally standing in my own space. No more pretending. No more waiting for her to come back. But the thing about hitting rock bottom? It leaves you with nothing but time to think. And man, did I think. About how I let things slide when I should have spoken up. About how I ignored the signs because I didn't want to face the truth. About how I convinced myself that love was enough, even when it clearly wasn't. The next morning, I woke up to the blinding light of reality, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like staying in bed. I got up, made myself coffee just for me, and started making a list. Not a list of revenge plans or sad, self-pitying thoughts. A list of everything I wanted to reclaim. My life. My hobbies. My sanity. Step 1. Get out of that apartment. The place was a graveyard of memories, and I needed a fresh start. I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. He didn't even sound surprised. Maybe he'd seen this coming before I did. By the end of the week, I was packing my stuff into boxes, tossing out anything that had Jessica's fingerprints on it. It felt good. Therapeutic, even. Like I was peeling off layers of a life that didn't fit me anymore. I moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of town, a place that didn't have our history embedded in the walls, but even with the new space, the ghost of our relationship lingered. You don't just erase years of memories with a fresh coat of paint. It hit me in the quiet moments, the mornings when I woke up and instinctively reached for her, only to find an empty bed. The nights when I'd hear a song we used to love and feel that familiar ache in my chest. One night, a couple of weeks after the move, I found myself scrolling through my phone, staring at old photos. Us at the beach, laughing at some inside joke. Her reading a book on the balcony, completely lost in her own world. Our wedding day, when I thought we had forever ahead of us, that I should have deleted them. I knew that. But instead, I kept scrolling, letting the memories wash over me like waves. And as I stared at those photos, something strange happened. That I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt detached. Like I was looking at someone else's life, someone else's story, and that's when it hit me: Jessica didn't destroy me. She betrayed me, yes. She ripped out my heart and stomped on it like it meant nothing. But she didn't destroy me. I was still here. Still breathing. Still living. That I realized I'd been giving her way too much power over my life. Her choices didn't define me, mine did. And I was done letting her shadow loom over everything I did. The next day, I deleted the photos. All of them. It felt like closing a chapter I'd been stuck rereading for way too long. I wasn't erasing the past, I was just choosing not to live in it anymore. From that point on, things started to change. I threw myself into work, picked up old hobbies I'd forgotten about, and even started reconnecting with friends I'd drifted from. I was rebuilding, piece by piece, and it felt damn good. And then, out of nowhere, life threw me a curveball. That I was at a bookstore one afternoon, browsing through the shelves, when I heard someone call my name, Alex. I turned around, and there she was, Emma. An old friend from college, someone I hadn't seen in years. She was standing there, smiling like no time had passed, holding a stack of books in her arms. Emma, I said, surprised but genuinely happy to see her. Wow, it's been, what, 8 years? 9, she laughed. But who's counting? We spent the next hour catching up over coffee, swapping stories about life, work, and everything in between. It felt easy, natural, like slipping into an old, comfortable sweater. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just two people reconnecting after life had pulled them in different directions. As we said goodbye, she gave me a quick hug and smiled. We should do this again sometime. And for the first time in a long time, I actually wanted to. Emma and I started meeting up more often after that day at the bookstore. It wasn't planned, it just sort of happened. A coffee here, a casual lunch there, and before I knew it, she'd become this constant, easy presence in my life. There was something refreshing about being around someone who had no connection to all the chaos I'd just crawled out of. She didn't look at me like I was the guy whose wife cheated. She just saw me, Alex, that we'd always had a good rapport back in college, but now, with years and life experiences between us, our connection felt different. Deeper. She had this way of listening that made me feel like my words actually mattered, like I wasn't just unloading my baggage onto someone who'd rather be anywhere else. One evening, after a spontaneous decision to grab dinner at this hole-in-the-wall taco joint, we ended up walking through the park near my new apartment. The air was crisp, the city lights reflecting off the water, and for the first time in months, I felt calm. You seem lighter, Emma said, glancing at me with a small smile. Like, the last time I saw you, it felt like you were carrying the world on your shoulders. But now, it's different. I thought about that for a second. She was right. I did feel lighter. The anger that had consumed me after Jessica's betrayal wasn't gone, but it wasn't suffocating me anymore. I wasn't defined by what happened, I was finally living beyond it. I guess I'm just realizing that life doesn't stop because someone screws you over, I replied, kicking a loose pebble along the path. It hurts, yeah, but you either let it drown you or you start swimming. Emma chuckled. Look at you, getting all philosophical on me. I laughed, the sound surprising even me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that freely, without the bitterness clinging to it. That we kept walking in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. And somewhere along that path, I felt it, the shift. That quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, I was ready for something new. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of work, random adventures with Emma, and rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. It wasn't like I was trying to fall into a new relationship, I was just finally letting life happen. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized how easy it was to be with her. Then, one night, everything changed. That we were sitting on my couch, watching some terrible horror movie we'd picked purely for the laughs, when the power went out. Typical Seattle weather: 1 minute calm, the next, a storm rolling in like it owned the place. The apartment plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering candles I'd randomly lit earlier. Guess the universe is telling us to stop torturing ourselves with bad movies, Emma joked, her face glowing softly in the candlelight. That I laughed, but my heart was racing for a different reason. There was something in the air, charged, electric. She turned to look at me, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The past, the betrayal, the hurt, it all disappeared in the space between us. Without thinking, I leaned in, and she met me halfway. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, and it felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just this connection, this moment. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine, her breath warm against my skin. I've wanted to do that for a while, she whispered. Me too, I admitted, my voice low, and just like that, everything changed. That we didn't rush into anything after that night. It wasn't about filling a void or escaping the past. It was about finding something real, something that felt honest in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. Emma wasn't a rebound, she was a reminder that life could still surprise me in the best ways. But even as things with Emma blossomed, the shadow of Jessica still lingered at the edges of my mind. It wasn't about missing her, I didn't. But closure? That was something I hadn't found yet. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew I wouldn't fully move on until I faced that part of my life head-on. So, one evening, after Emma had left, I sat down at my desk and pulled out my laptop. I didn't want to, but I needed to. I drafted a simple email to Jessica, not to reopen old wounds, but to close them for good. Jessica, I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to let you know that I'm moving on. I'm not angry anymore, and I don't need explanations. I just wanted to say that I'm happy, and I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. Take care, Alex. I hovered over the send button for a moment, my finger trembling slightly. But then, with a deep breath, I clicked it, and just like that, I felt free, not because I'd forgiven her, but because I'd finally chosen myself over the pain she caused. Life wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was mine again, and that was more than enough. After sending that email to Jessica, I expected to feel something. Relief, maybe. Closure. But the truth? I felt nothing. It was like writing those words and hitting send was the final act in a play I'd been starring in for far too long. There were no fireworks, no sudden waves of emotion. Just silence. And honestly, that silence felt like the loudest answer I could have hoped for. Jessica never replied. Not that I was expecting her to. The version of her I once loved probably would have written some long, dramatic message, filled with half-hearted apologies and justifications. But the Jessica who betrayed me? She was probably too wrapped up in her new life with him to bother. And that was fine. More than fine, actually. With that chapter officially closed, I threw myself into building something new, something better. Emma and I grew closer with every passing day. What started as casual meetups and spontaneous adventures slowly morphed into something deeper, something I hadn't expected but welcomed all the same. One Friday night, we were cooking dinner at my place, trying to cook. Emma had the brilliant idea that we should make homemade sushi, which neither of us knew how to do. The kitchen was a disaster, rice everywhere, vegetables chopped in uneven slices, and seaweed sheets stubbornly refusing to roll the way they were supposed to. But we were laughing the whole time, and it felt like we were kids again, making a mess just for the fun of it. At one point, Emma leaned against the counter, watching me struggle with a particularly rebellious sushi roll. You know, she said, her voice soft, you're kind of amazing. I looked up, rice sticking to my fingers, and raised an eyebrow. Amazing? You've seen me try to roll sushi, right? She chuckled, shaking her head. I'm serious, Alex. After everything you've been through, you're still standing. And you're still you. That's pretty amazing. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Because for the first time in a long time, I realized she was right. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. And that felt damn good that we finally gave up on the sushi and ordered takeout instead, collapsing onto the couch with our mismatched plates of food. The conversation drifted to everything and nothing: future travel plans, random childhood memories, even our most embarrassing moments. It was easy. Effortless. And as the night wore on, I found myself thinking about the future in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. After dinner, we sat in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was in that quiet, simple moment that I realized something big: that I was falling for her, not in the reckless, head-over-heels way I had with Jessica. This was different. This was steady, grounding, like finding solid ground after years of walking on shaky footing. Emma wasn't just a distraction from my past, she was part of my future, but with that realization came a wave of fear. What if I wasn't ready? What if the scars Jessica left behind were still too fresh? I didn't want to hurt Emma, and I sure as hell didn't want to mess up something that felt this right. The next morning, I woke up with those thoughts still swirling in my head. Emma was still asleep, curled up beside me, looking peaceful and content. I watched her for a moment, wondering how the hell I got so lucky. But instead of letting the fear consume me, I made a decision that I was going to stop letting my past dictate my future. Later that day, while we were out for a walk in the park, I decided to be honest. Emma, I said, stopping by a bench overlooking the lake. Can I tell you something? She looked at me, her expression open and curious. Of course. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I've been thinking a lot about us. And how much you mean to me. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. She reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Scared of what? Of messing this up, I admitted. Of letting what happened with Jessica get in the way of something that could be really great. Emma was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. Not the kind of smile that brushed off my fears, but one that acknowledged them. Accepted them. Alex, she said softly, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm just asking you to be you. We'll figure it out together, okay? And in that moment, I knew I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to keep moving forward. One step at a time. That night, as we sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope, real, honest-to-God hope. Weeks turned into months, and life began to feel like it was finally mine again. The shadows Jessica left behind were still there, but they no longer defined my days. They were like old scars, faint reminders of what I'd been through, but no longer sources of pain. I had stopped waking up with that sinking feeling in my chest, and I'd stopped replaying every argument, every lie, in my head like some endless loop I couldn't escape from. Emma had a lot to do with that we'd settled into this easy, natural rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. We weren't trying to impress each other, and we weren't pretending to be something we weren't. We'd both been through enough to know that life is messy, and people are flawed, but that's what made it beautiful. One Saturday morning, Emma showed up at my apartment with 2 cups of coffee and a mischievous grin. Pack a bag, she said, tossing one of the cups at me. We're going on an adventure. Where? I asked, still half asleep, hair sticking up in every direction. She shrugged. Does it matter? And that was the thing about Emma, she didn't need everything mapped out. She lived in the moment, and being around her made me want to do the same. So, I packed a bag without asking questions, and we hit the road that we drove for hours with no particular destination, just the open road ahead of us and music blasting from the speakers. We sang off-key, stopped at random diners, and took every weird detour we could find. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like freedom. The kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. At one point, we stumbled across this little lake tucked away in the woods. The kind of place you'd never find unless you were hopelessly lost, which, of course, we were. We parked the car, kicked off our shoes, and waded into the water, laughing like a couple of kids who didn't have a care in the world. As we sat on the shore, letting the sun dry us off, Emma turned to me with a serious look in her eyes. "You've changed," she said softly. I raised an eyebrow. "Changed how?" She smiled, tucking a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "When I first ran into you at that bookstore, you were heavy. Like you were carrying this invisible weight around. But now? You seem lighter. Happier." I thought about that for a moment, staring out at the rippling water. She was right. I was lighter. It wasn't just about moving on from Jessica, it was about finally reclaiming my life. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't defined by the person who hurt me. "I think I finally let it go," I admitted. "All of it." She reached over, lacing her fingers through mine. "I'm glad you did." We sat there for a while, just holding hands and watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was simple, but it felt like everything. I didn't need grand gestures or over-the-top romance. I just needed this. Someone who saw me, understood me, and didn't try to change me. When we got back to the car, Emma reached into her bag and pulled out an old Polaroid camera. "One more thing," she said, snapping a photo of me before I could even react. I groaned, laughing as I tried to grab the camera. "What was that for?" She shrugged, tucking the photo into her bag. "Proof. Proof that you survived. That you're still here." And that hit me harder than I expected because I had survived. I'd been through hell, but I'd come out the other side stronger than I ever thought possible. A few weeks later, as we were sitting on my balcony watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I realized something else. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. Emma turned to me, her eyes sparkling in the soft glow of the streetlights. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked, her voice gentle. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "Not really," I said honestly. "She's part of my story, sure. But she's not the main character anymore." Emma smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "Good. And I meant it. Jessica was a chapter in my life, but she wasn't the whole book. I'd spent so much time mourning what I thought I'd lost, but the truth was, I hadn't lost anything that mattered. I'd gained clarity. I'd gained strength. And I'd gained the freedom to write my own story." That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, I sat on the balcony, staring up at the stars. I thought about everything I'd been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the nights I thought I'd never feel whole again. And for the first time, I felt grateful for the pain, grateful for the lessons, grateful for the chance to start over. Because here's the thing about betrayal: it can break you, sure. But it can also build you. Piece by piece, day by day, it can shape you into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient than you ever thought possible. I learned that I'm not defined by the people who hurt me. I'm defined by how I rise after the fall. So, if you're reading this and you're stuck in that same dark place I was, wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, you will. It doesn't happen overnight. It's messy and painful and exhausting. But one day, you'll wake up, and the weight will feel lighter. The memories will sting less. And you'll realize that you're not just surviving, you're living, and sometimes, that's the best revenge of all.